So, I just got through my first 50 rolls of Kentmere, and today we're going to chat about how that has been. Wait, hold up. Hey Jeremy, I thought you were happy with Fomapan? Well, yes, that's true, and I've been loving the tones of Foma 400 until one day this happened. But more on that in just a bit. In an earlier video titled My First 200 Rolls of Fomapan, I shared with you everything about what Fomapan did well, what it didn't do so well, and why I loved it. Since then, I've gone through another 150 more rolls of Fomapan, give or take, and everything was just fine. I was happy with the pictures. Yes, here and there, I was running into the same QC issues that I talked about in that earlier video, but for a large majority of the pictures, I was happy. Until one day, my pictures started looking like this. They started coming out severely underexposed. Now, before you say, Jeremy, you probably didn't shoot it right, that's exactly what I thought too. But the thing is, like I mentioned in greater detail in my earlier video, I went through countless rolls of Fomapan, testing how the film responded to different lighting situations, different exposures, and I put in so much time tweaking development times, agitation speeds, all to get Fomapan to a place where I liked it. Weeks and weeks of experimentation. And where I finally landed was 1+31 dilution Ilfotec HC at 30 RPM on a rotary processor at 20 degrees for 14 minutes. I found the formula right. I was really happy with the tones, and even rewatching my old video of my first 200 rolls of Fomapan today, it's been a while, and I still think the tones look really nice. So I thought to myself, if I already found the formula to tones that I love, why then were my pictures suddenly looking so bad? The first thing I thought was bad developer. So I used that exact same bottle to develop a roll of HP5, and everything looked fine. Nothing was wrong with the developer. Next, I thought maybe it was my camera. I started shooting this beautiful, tiny, vintage, compact, medium format camera, the Hasselblad SWC, which full video on that is coming out soon. But this camera is old, so I thought, okay, maybe the shutter speed times on this camera were running a bit fast, so let me try out a different camera. And I put in a roll of Fomapan into a Rolleiflex, and same problem. Roll after roll using different cameras of 120 Fomapan 400 returned severely underexposed, to the point where I did an A/B test of Fomapan and a different film stock, and I happened to have a spare roll of Kentmere 400 lying around. I loaded them both into the exact same camera, so the SWC with two different backs, exact same camera, exact same lens, and check out the results for yourself. Now, perhaps this was just a one-off thing, right? Maybe Fomapan released a bad batch of film. Maybe I just had a few bad rolls. But after going through almost 20 rolls of 120 Fomapan, all of them exhibiting this severe underexposure, I just had enough. The black dots were fine, but what I was not willing to risk is packing for a trip, a bag full of film, going somewhere meaningful that I might never go back to again, putting in all that time and effort to make, then develop, and then scan the pictures and haul around all that gear just to come home and find everything dead. That was not something I was willing to risk. And so, there was one whole month of troubleshooting, test shots, process of elimination. It was time to try something else. And the closest option out there to me is Kentmere. Now, Kentmere is a film that I've used before, but I've not really particularly liked it. It was always just a bit too polished. But taste changes over time, so I thought, maybe, I should just give it another shot again. not only shoot 1 or 2 rolls of it, but actually go through a good amount. And so that's what I did. I put in an order for 50 rolls of Kentmere 120, and that's why we're here today. Made by Harman, which also produces Ilfotec films, Kentmere is a more inexpensive alternative to, say, HP5, which costs about 50% more. I've been primarily using it in 120, so medium format, and developed on a rotary processor. And I have to say, so far I've been quite pleased. Now, I touched on this briefly in the video on Fomapan, but the differences between Kentmere and Fomapan are almost like night and day. Yes, they're both black and white film, but their tones are miles apart. They're pretty much the two most differing film stocks I could think of to compare. Now, coming from Fomapan is grungy, grainy, gritty, and full of character, while Kentmere is bright, lush, posh, more accurate and precise. If Fomapan is mysterious, Kentmere is clean. If Fomapan is raw, Kentmere is genteel. If Fomapan is from the 50s, Kentmere is from the 90s. They are really different. But different doesn't mean good or bad. It really depends what you are going for. And the first thing that I've been really enjoying about Kentmere, especially having come straight from Fomapan, which I've been so used to, is Kentmere has a much more neutral representation of skin tones. Fomapan always gave skin tones a certain look to it, a very distinctive look. Due to its sensitivity to certain frequencies of light, it has character, it's strong in its character, and some people like it, some people don't. But coming straight off the heels of Fomapan, Kentmere definitely feels much more neutral, especially in the skin tones. Now, the second thing that I've been really enjoying about Kentmere is its ability to represent a large array of gray tones, all the way from the deepest shadows to the brightest highlights, all with nuance. It has a ton of tonal information, dynamic range, and is far more forgiving of film stock exposure-wise, especially compared to Fomapan, and that makes it much more general purpose. In a sense, it's going to give you more pleasing results over a larger set of differing scenes with less tweaks on your end. So if you're looking for one film stock to do everything, Kentmere is a great option. The third thing, and probably the most important and biggest factor that will make me reach for Kentmere over Fomapan, is its ability to be used in low light. More specifically, its ability to be pushed to ISO 1600 and 3200. Now, while I really love the look of Fomapan 400 pushed to 800, it's a film that really just doesn't do very great at ISO 1600. And you can forget about getting normal results at 3200. I mean, Fomapan at 3200 is a look, but it kind of enters experimental photography. So with Fomapan, I'd say 800 is my personal limit. And even if you try to develop for longer or increase the concentration of your developer or even the temperature, you're not really going to pull more exposure information out of it. But with Kentmere, it effortlessly goes to 1600, and you can even use it at 3200 in a pinch by extending development times even further, though you definitely do see it reaching its limit at 3200. But push 2 stops to 1600, effortless. And that one extra stop of usability in low light compared to Fomapan is a huge practical benefit to your picture making, especially when you're using lenses that don't have a super large aperture. Now, something interesting that I've noticed about Kentmere is how it responds to light. In my testing, I found that while it is forgiving, meaning if you under or overexposed by a bit, you're still gonna get a really nice picture. But the tones of Kentmere actually changes quite significantly depending on whether you over or underexpose. So the amount of light you give it significantly alters its tones. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at this exposure test. With this scene, I made a bunch of pictures at different aperture values while keeping the shutter speed the same. But to better understand this in detail, you do need some understanding of relative exposure of different regions within a frame, which we will go over as well. I measured several specific points within this exact scene with a spot meter to determine their isolated exposure values, moving from darkest to lightest with shutter speed kept at a constant of 1/30th of a second. The third step up read at f4, the door on the left read at f8, the handwritings on the wall read f11, and the lamp read f32. So what that means is if the door reads at f8 and we expose the entire picture for f8, then the door would be at 0 EV. The steps at f4 would be 2 stops under what we exposed the picture for, and the lamp, which is f32, would be 4 stops over what we exposed the picture for. So if we expose the picture at f11, that means the handwriting on the wall, which read at f11, would be at 0 EV. The door would be 1 stop under, and the steps would be 3 stops under, and the lamp would be 3 stops over, so on and so forth. Now, if this is the first time you're hearing this, exposure being described in this way, and if you're finding it confusing, don't worry, watch this entire section again, or leave a comment below and I'm sure someone would help you out, but try to understand this because it would really help us get a better idea of the usable exposure range of Kentmere. It helps us understand how much Kentmere can be under or overexposed while still holding on to information, and getting a deeper understanding of this would help you make better exposures as well. So first off, let's take a look at highlights. When the picture was exposed at f4, the lamp, being f32, is overexposed by 6 stops. And you can see that from the negative. There's barely any information there, everything is just dense and black. When the picture was exposed at f5.6, that's 5 stops over. It's still a blob of blackness, but at 4 stops over, we begin to see separation between the lamp and the white wall behind. That tells us that we can overexpose Kentmere by about 4 stops and it's still going to hold out. Awesome. That's the exposure ceiling. What about the floor? Let's take a look at the steps, which gave a spot meter reading of f4. When the picture is exposed at f4, then the dark steps would be properly exposed, and that's what we see, lots of detail and texture in the steps. If the picture is exposed for f5.6, then the steps would be 1 stop under at -1 EV, and we still see information, which is great. Now at 2 stops under, we begin to lose information, and at 3 stops under, almost all the shadow information is gone. We can still make out the lines in the steps, but the texture in the steps are barely noticeable. And at 4 stops under, almost all information in the steps is gone. So that tells us that we have shadow information up to -2.5 stops under what we're exposing for. Let's double check that with the texture of the door. The door reads f8, so that means with the picture exposed at f16, the door would be about 2 stops under and there should still be information there. And yep, that's exactly what we see. The wood grain is still visible, but by f22 or 3 stops under, all that information is gone. So the exposure latitude of Kentmere is about 2.5 stops under and about 4 stops over, so that's about 6.5 stops of usable dynamic range. Sounds about right. But the most interesting thing I noticed in this test wasn't just the maximum or minimum exposure of Kentmere, but how the tones of the mid-range changed depending on how much light this film received. Remember in an earlier video on Fomapan, where we talked about Kentmere's weakness being its mid-range, while Fomapan's weakness was its extremes of the tone curve. Well, this is what we're really seeing here. If you take a look at the gradation in tones between the two sides of the middle white wall, at f4, this region reads 3 stops over, so the information is still there, but the relative difference in tones between the left side and the right side becomes very close. It's like the mid-range bunches up and becomes flat. The less light you give it, the more separation you begin to see between the two shades of grey. And by the time you hit f11, the separation becomes much more natural. Now this isn't unique to Kentmere, and other film stocks also exhibit this tendency as well, but based on my personal testing and my experience using different film stocks, not to this degree. So keep that in mind. With Kentmere, the more you err towards the side of underexposure, the mid-range becomes more contrasty, and the more you expose, the more light you give it, the flatter the picture becomes. So that's the exposure test. How has it been in general? Well, I've been really enjoying its ability to handle highlights. When you overexpose it, they don't just blow out like Fomapan, and that's what makes it really forgiving. The information is all still there. But like we saw in the exposure test, if you overexpose it too much, the mid-range starts to clump together, and to me, it just doesn't look that great. It looks kind of flat, and it doesn't have that richness which I really like in black and white pictures. So if you have shot Kentmere before and you have found it too flat, experiment with erring towards the side of underexposure. And knowing this allows you to use Kentmere to better aid your pictures. It allows you to expose stylistically, not just technically. So for example, if you're shooting a very high contrast scene, overexpose slightly to tame that contrast. Or if you're shooting a very flat scene, then you can err towards the side of underexposure to boost the contrast slightly. So it allows you to not just expose for what is technically right, but for the tones that you are after. So that was my first 50 rolls of Kentmere. I hope you found that interesting and helpful. Jeremy here. Let me know any of your thoughts in the comment section below. Do you love Kentmere? Hate Kentmere? Is there any other film that you'd like me to try? Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.